So I wanted to talk to you guys today about an interesting concept that actually Arashi and I wrote an article on that was published in Enable Sysadmin. And in that article, we showed how with recent Docker Compose support in Podman 3, how we could walk from a Docker Compose YAML file all the way to Kubernetes deployment using Podman. And I wanted to take this opportunity to present more or less the same kind of idea, but be able to dive into some of the specifics and answer questions along the way. And then at each step, I'll present a little demo so that folks can see this actually kind of going and how it worked. So before we kind of get into that, it's worthwhile sort of understanding Podman's ability to hand off to Kubernetes and what we as a development team think our role is with Kubernetes. And that is that it's primarily a sort of a development environment. You know, of course, it's a single node, it's not orchestrated, but it's a very good way to test builds that you want to use, image builds that you want to use in Kubernetes, and do that iterative style of testing. And then once you have your images where you want them, perhaps even testing how they work together and making sure that when they're deployed that you're gonna have a nice smooth deployment and things will work and come up right away. So what Podman can do to assist here is you can use Podman for that development as a container runtime, but then you can use some functions that are built into Podman that allow you to transition to Kubernetes. And specifically, we allow you to generate Kubernetes YAML from a container running in by Podman. And then we also support a replay function of that YAML back into Podman. We think that this is really an area of growth for Podman, and we like to continue to hear what folks think. As we don't have a specific plan in mind here, we've got a couple of ideas, and we've primarily relied on users kind of showing us the natural way. But the idea that Podman on a single node could be used to help a user and maybe even a user that's not all that up to snuff with Kubernetes be able to take what was a development idea or a development application and get that into Kubernetes with a smooth transition, and not really knowing too much about YAML files. It seems to be a bit of a stumbling block. So that's kind of where we see Podman, and that's where we think that we can grow in the future. I wanted to show an overview of this, and I can come back to this slide if folks have questions, but I wanted to give the overview. So if we look at Compose, it uses a RESTful API to talk with Docker. That was the original deployment. When we bring Podman into the equation, we can also talk directly with Compose, and Compose can talk directly with us. And then we can take those containers that were created by the Compose YAML file, and we can generate Kubernetes YAML file that represents that, which we can then put into Kubernetes and run it there, or we can replay it or play it as it were, where we take the Kubernetes YAML file and we can play it, and you get the exact same experience. The containers are up and running, only now they're in a pod, and you can then do an iterative design with your YAML just in Podman, so that when you do go to Kubernetes, it goes smoothly. Okay, so what is Compose for those that haven't used it or haven't heard of it? It's an orchestration tool from Docker. It uses RESTful APIs to communicate with Docker and Podman. And again, Compose support for Podman came in version 3. Our support at this point is for rootful only. And there's some limitations there, although we are working on rootless. And we do not support swarm. And when we think about Compose, one of the questions that we have as a team is, what does the future hold for Compose? It appears that Kubernetes has won, or clearly won, the orchestration of containers. Where is Compose going to go? So that's something we're keeping an eye on. So let's have a demo, and I will in a second break off to an Ask Nima video and then play that for you guys and try to comment on it. But before we launch into that, what I'm using is an example that actually Docker provides in their awesome Compose Git repository. And it's essentially a WordPress and MySQL example. And when it runs and runs successfully, it results in getting something like this screen on the right, which is the WordPress configuration when you first run it. Now, one thing is I'll be running it in a terminal, so I use something like Lynx, but you'll see the familiarity of that page. Here is the demo. Okay, and so the first thing I'm going to do is show you the packages that are meaningful here, and you can see that I will have a Podman 3.0, a package called Podman Docker, and Docker Compose, which can be installed on Fedora without Docker. Now, the first thing you do is you start the Podman socket, which is a socket that listens on the RESTful interfaces. And I'm also going to show you that var run Docker stock has been symlinked by that Podman Docker package. And here is a typical Docker Compose project, like I mentioned, the WordPress MySQL. And it has that Docker Compose.yaml in it. And this is what it looks like. There's no image building in this particular one, but that is supported and works quite nicely with Podman as well.
Brent, any chance you could make it slightly bigger?
I can try.
Yeah. There's also a question in the chat. Does Podman support the build now, like Docker Compose build?
Yes. I think that's the best I can do.
Yeah, that's better than what it was.
Okay. So we looked at the YAML file, and right now I'm issuing the command to Docker Compose up, and the -d means to detach so that it can continue to use the terminal once it's up and running. So I had pre-cached the images so that it was a quick exercise. Taking a look now, we should see a couple containers running, which we do. We see the port mapping for 80. We'll see that it had created its own network. It created a volume. And now I'm just going to use the little Lynx CLI web browser to verify that it's working. So there we go. Now we can take everything down with a simple Docker Compose verb there of going down. Containers have been stopped. See that they've been removed. The network has been removed. And that should do it. So that portion right there was just getting the containers to run using Docker Compose and Podman. We haven't taken the next step yet, which is to run a command in Podman called generate Kube. What it can do, generate Kube, is it can snapshot running containers and pods that you have in Podman and translate that into Kubernetes-based YAML, valid Kubernetes-based YAML. At this time, you can either snapshot multiple containers and that, or a single container or a pod at this point. But just to have a heads up, version 3 is the first version that we allow the snapshotting of multiple containers. Previous versions, you could only do one at a time. So all containers will end up as pods because this is Kubernetes. And we are also capable of generating a service file on the fly with it so that you can expose your services when they're put into Kubernetes. And as I hinted earlier, this command works nicely with another command called podman play. And it's the yin to the yang of podman generate, where you can then replay this YAML locally. And so I will show a demo of that, and I'll try to do the same thing here.
So a couple of questions before Brent.
Sure.
One question is, why sudo?
Because Docker Compose, so Docker is rootful always, and its use of Compose, our initial target was to make it rootful, work for rootful. There are some technical challenges we have with making Compose work with rootless.
All right. And then a follow-up question is, what online IDE is this?
Are they talking?
Yeah.
For the demo, this is the black screen. That's Ask Anima.
Yep. All right. This was answered in chat, but we can take it anyways. You folks are using the Python code from Docker Compose, or is it a forked, modified version of it to work with Podman?
Didn't quite catch that, but did someone answer it?
Yeah, the answer is it's the standard Compose. There are no changes to it.
Correct. Yeah.
One more. Is there a same kind of conversion from Docker Compose YAML going to Kubernetes if I don't use Podman?
No. That's why we rule.
All right, please go ahead with the demo now.
Okay. But we're going to do, I just want to show the help screen for generate to get this sort of started. And you can see there that it's a pretty simple command, pretty simple verb. And I will recreate the containers again. This is the same exercise that we just saw. They went up. And now we'll take a look at the containers. We do need their names so that we can feed generate the correct information. And the syntax is simply podman generate. I'm going to add a -s to also make a service since we want to expose that service. And then I'm also signifying what file I want this to end up into. And now I'm just popping in the 2 container names. IDs also work. And this is what the file looks like. One thing I wanted to point out was at the bottom, there's where the service is tacked on, and you can see that here. Okay, so that's how you generate the YAML.
Follow-up question, can I select multiple containers with asterisks?
No, we don't support that syntax, but if you feel that's really important, you could potentially file an issue and see if we can make that work. All right, so I mentioned about Podman Play, and it sort of bookends the Podman generate. So this is the second half of, you're still in Podman here, but basically you have the ability to ingest a Kubernetes YAML file that you created earlier or created in Kubernetes and run it in Podman and get a local set of containers on your single workstation, if you will. And what this really was meant for is so that you can do that iterative development that I spoke of based on a YAML file and based on something that can be used in Kubernetes. So we're not just limited to running containers in our own runtime here. We want to be able to have Podman be able to lift users into Kubernetes and assist in that. Okay, and so we will play that one. This one has a little bit more of a complex set of verbs, but nevertheless, I think they're pretty straightforward. Basically allows you to, on the fly, change the way that this YAML or these containers, actually it'll be a pod with containers, how it will run. So we still have the stuff running from earlier, and I need to get those cleaned out so that we can run fresh.
Brent, can you scroll down? We're not seeing the bottom terminal. Thanks.
All right, so what just happened? Let me rewind that a little bit to where we were. This is a repeat, but we're bringing down the containers that Docker Compose ran. And now we're going to go ahead and run or play our file. Okay, so what it did is check for a new image and ran it. And you can see that you get a net message about a pod. And so if we do look in Podman and we look at our pods, we got that single pod with 3 containers, which is really the pod infra container and the 2 that are in question. And if we look at, I'm taking a look here at MySQL to make sure it's come up before I try to tickle this thing up. And then I rerun the links command and we have our config screen again.
Question, Brent.
Yes.
So if I understand all of this from the demos, this only works on Kubernetes clusters which use Podman as a runtime, or can I use Podman locally and deploy this YAML directly to Kubernetes with CRI-O?
The latter. So in this particular scenario that I'm painting for you folks, this is just me running Podman on my laptop, and then you can lift that to any Kubernetes kind of approach, whether it's Minikube or OpenShift or whatever. As long as the syntax is valid of the file and that they're sort of at the same level, then everything should be nice. Okay. Oop. And so we're back into the next step. So we can use, as I mentioned earlier, the Podman generate kube file to launch in a Kubernetes instance. That's what we were just talking about. One little thing is, if we have images that we specially built for this exercise, you do just need to push those to a registry beforehand. That would be the case with any launch of a Kubernetes instance. And before we jump into the demo here, because of the way that these containers interact with each other, they use TCP/IP to interact. And so WordPress has a environment variable called dbHost. And rather than use the container name here, because they're in the same pod, I just entered the localhost IP address. So if you're trying to repeat this, the article also discusses that this is one little tweak you need to manually make due to the fact that there's a little bit of difference on how these two work together.
There is another question. Is Podman
Sure.
Kube integratable with systemd as services?
You know, I haven't tried that, but I think that would be an awesome experiment. Sounds like a blog we could write. Okay, so this is the last step here, and I'll go ahead and run this one. Now we're going to take our local file and we're going to send it off to a Kubernetes instance. In this case, I just have a Minikube instance running on my laptop, and I ran the simple command of kube control and create it. And you can see that it created both the service and the pod. If we take a look at the pod, we see it running, ready to go, and we just check the IP address of the pod so that we can see if this experiment or what I'm saying actually works. And there's our familiar screen. And that's the presentation. I'm happy to take questions. I have no idea where I am for time.
Time, we have a few more minutes. I don't see any more questions in the chat right now.
Okay. How about this? Anything that people would like to see functionally added to this? Anything that people have an idea on that I can steal and make my own?
So there is a question from Dan. Do you see the Kubernetes YAML as a possible replacement for Compose YAML for local use cases?
Absolutely. I think in particular, when we look at the little flow chart I had, as a Podman developer, the one thing I don't see very helpful is the fact that the Docker Compose file is not compatible with anything else. It's a one-way street. In the case of the Kubernetes YAML, we can run that in both Kubernetes and Podman. So to me, that's more of an ideal environment. You get more bang for your buck, and you can use these iterative development opportunities that Podman provides on your local client to just hammer out anything real quick or share with another developer. We've had people doing that where they were working on something, couldn't quite get it right, and decided to share with another developer.
All right, next. Shouldn't it be called Container Compose then, keeping with the container host and container file theme of Podman, that is?
Yeah, I mean, we don't own, this team didn't make, Docker Compose, but we definitely heard from everyone that Podman needed to play nice with Docker Compose in order to be, successful. And as far as how the commands were named, it is the case that, for example, when we listened to Valentin yesterday, Podman generate does more than Kube, it does systemd. And we think there may be opportunity in the future for another verb to be added to the play command. And as people are pointing out, engineers are horrible at naming things.